Imagine a young nation, barely 30 years old, standing up to the greatest empire on earth. A nation humiliated. Its soldiers surrendered. Its capital burned to the ground. Yet in the middle of chaos, ordinary men and women, sailors and militia rose to defy impossible odds. This is the story of a war that tested courage, honor, and identity. A war that would shape America forever. Stay with us, because what happened next will shock you, inspire you, and redefine what it meant to be free in 1812. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the early years of the 19th century, the world was already on fire. Europe was drowning in blood under the shadow of Napoleon. Empires clashed across oceans, and the young United States stood unsteady on its feet, independent, yes, but fragile, uncertain, and constantly tested. The War of 1812 did not begin with a single gunshot or a single declaration. It began with humiliation, with sailors dragged from American ships, with borders that meant little, with a nation struggling to decide whether it would bend or stand. Imagine the Atlantic in those years. Gray, endless water. American merchant ships creaking under full sails, carrying grain, timber, hope. Then British warships appear on the horizon, powerful, experienced, ruthless. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, and to keep its empire alive during the Napoleonic Wars, it needed sailors. So Britain did what empires often do when desperate. It took them. American sailors were stopped, searched, accused of being British deserters, and impressed, forced into service. Some never saw home again. For the United States, this was more than policy. It was an insult carved into flesh. In Washington, anger simmered. The nation was barely 3 decades old, still arguing over its identity, still divided between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, between merchants and farmers, between fear and pride. President James Madison was not a warrior by nature. He was quiet, intellectual, cautious. But pressure mounted. Young congressmen, the war hawks, spoke of horror, of sovereignty, of a final break from British control. They believed war would be quick. Canada, they said, would fall easily. History would prove how wrong they were. When war was declared in June 1812, the United States was unprepared. The Army was small, poorly trained. Generals were old or inexperienced. Supply lines were fragile. And across the border stood British regulars, hardened by years of fighting Napoleon, aided by Native American nations who saw in Britain a passable shield against American expansion. For them, this war was not about flags or impressment. It was about survival. The early invasions of Canada were disasters. American troops crossed rivers full of confidence and came back broken, if they came back at all. At Detroit, an entire American army surrendered without a major battle. Panic spread. Newspapers mocked the war. New England whispered of secession. It seemed the young republic had bitten off more than it could endure, but war has a way of revealing unexpected strength. On the Great Lakes, American shipbuilders worked day and night. Timber was cut, hulls were raised, guns were mounted. On Lake Erie, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry faced a superior British fleet. The battle was brutal. Ships shattered. Men bled into the water. Perry's flagship was destroyed beneath him, yet he refused to surrender. He climbed into a small boat under fire and rowed to another ship to continue the fight. When it was over, he sent a message that would echo through history. We have met the enemy and they are ours. For the first time, Americans believed this war could be won. Meanwhile, the conflict tore through the frontier. Native American leaders like Tecumseh fought with determination and clarity, seeking to stop the endless push westward. Tecumseh was not merely a warrior. He was a statesman, a visionary who understood what was at stake. His death in battle was not just a tactical loss. It was the collapse of a dream for unity among native nations. For them, the War of 1812 ended not with victory or defeat, but with displacement and silence. Then came 1814, and with it, fire. British forces freed from the struggle in Europe after Napoleon's defeat turned their full attention to America. They sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, marched on Washington, and met little resistance. Government officials fled. Panic ruled the streets, and as night fell, British soldiers set fire to the symbols of American governance, the Capitol, the Treasury, the President's house. Flames climbed into the sky. Smoke swallowed the city. The heart of the nation burned. But even in that humiliation, something unbreakable formed. When the British moved on Baltimore, they expected another easy victory. Instead, they found resistance. At Fort McHenry, under relentless bombardment, American defenders held on through the night. Rockets screamed, cannons thundered, and as dawn broke, the flag was still there, torn, smoked, but standing. A young lawyer watching from a ship put his feelings into words, and those words became a song that would outlive the war itself. The conflict staggered toward its end, exhausted and unresolved. Peace negotiations in Ghent dragged on. No clear victor emerged. Borders remained largely unchanged. Many of the original causes were left unaddressed, and yet, after the treaty was signed, unaware that peace had already been declared, one final battle would define how the war was remembered. At New Orleans, in January 1815, American forces under Andrew Jackson faced a powerful British army. The British advanced in tight formations across open ground. The Americans waited behind earthworks, rifles steady, hearts pounding. When the firing began, it was devastating. In minutes, the field was covered with fallen redcoats. The British attack collapsed. It was a stunning, one-sided victory, and it burned itself into the national memory. The War of 1812 ended not with triumph, but with transformation. America did not win in the way empires win. It survived. It proved to itself more than anyone else that it could stand against the greatest power on earth and endure. The war exposed weakness, division, and suffering. It destroyed cities and lives. It betrayed native allies. It left widows, scars, and unanswered questions. But it also forged a deeper sense of identity. The idea of American began to mean something shared, something defended with blood. This was a war of miscalculation and courage, of loss and defiance. A war where sailors were stolen, capitals burned, Ned and flags became symbols of stubborn hope. It was not glorious. It was human. And in that humanity, fear, pride, pain, resilience, the War of 1812 carved its place in history, not as a footnote, but as a trail by fire for a nation still learning how to exist. At the dawn of the 19th century, the United States was a nation still learning how to breathe on its own. Independence had been won on paper, but respect was another matter entirely. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire was locked in a desperate struggle, with Napoleonic France fighting not just for territory, but for survival. The seas became battlefields, and on those seas sailed American merchant ships, neutral in theory, vulnerable in reality. Britain did not see neutrality as sacred. It saw ships, sailors, and opportunity. British warships prowled the Atlantic like iron shadows. When they stopped American vessels, the inspections were not polite or restrained. Sailors were lined up, questioned, judged by accent or appearance, and taken away in chains. This practice, known as impressment, was justified by Britain as the reclaiming of deserters from the Royal Navy. In practice, it was theft. Thousands of American sailors vanished into British service, forced to fight wars that were not theirs, whipped for disobedience, buried at sea under foreign flags. Each disappearance echoed back to American ports, to taverns and homes where family waited for men who would never return. For the young republic, Impressment struck at the core of sovereignty. A nation that could not protect its citizens could not truly call itself free. Yet the United States was weak. Its navy was small, its economy tied closely to British trade, its political leadership divided and cautious. Protest notes were written, envoys were sent, tempers flared and cooled again. Britain apologized without changing its behavior. Each insult piled atop the last, creating a quiet fury that spread through newspapers, dockyards, and congressional halls. The ocean itself became a symbol of humiliation. American ships flew their flags proudly, but those flags did not stop British cannons from firing warning shots across bows. They did not stop boarding parties from climbing aboard. They did not stop officers from pointing at men and declaring their lives no longer their own. To many Americans, especially those who lived by the sea, this was a continuation of colonial subjugation under a different name. The revolution had been fought to escape British control, and now that control was reasserting itself. Through force and arrogance, national honor became a word spoken with clenched teeth. In Congress, young men rose to prominence who believed patience was cowardice. They argued that a nation unwilling to defend its honor would invite endless abuse. These war hawks spoke of impressment not as a diplomatic issue, but as a moral wound. They framed the conflict in stark terms. Either the United States would accept being treated as a lesser power, or it would prove that independence meant something more than parchment declarations. Maritime control was the other blade cutting deep into American pride. Britain's naval blockade of France did not distinguish between enemy and neutral trade. American merchants found their goods seized, their routes closed, their profits destroyed. Entire coastal economies suffered. Farmers inland felt the ripple effects as prices fell and exports stalled. The promise of prosperity that had followed independence seemed suddenly fragile, dependent on the whims of a foreign navy that answered to no one in Washington. This was not merely economic pressure, it was a reminder of imbalance. Britain ruled the seas. Its ships were everywhere, its cannons unmatched, its sailors trained by years of constant war. The United States, by contrast, had a handful of frigates and a Navy budget argued over endlessly in Congress. Each confrontation at sea underscored that disparity. Every boarded ship told Americans that freedom on land meant Lilith the ocean, or owned by someone else. Public anger grew unevenly region by region. In New England, where trade with Britain was vital, many saw war as reckless. In the South and West, far from British markets and closer to frontier conflicts, outrage burned hotter. Impressment stories circulated like folklore, growing darker with each retelling. Sailors spoke of lashes, of forced allegiance, of dying under a flag they despised. These Tories were not abstract. They had names, faces, families. President James Madison found himself trapped between principle and practicality. He understood the insult, felt the weight of national honor, yet feared the consequences of war. The United States was not ready. But how long could a nation wait while its citizens were seized and its commerce strangled? Each year of inaction made the government look weaker, its protests more hollow. Britain interpreted restraint not as wisdom but as acceptance. The Chesapeake Leopard affair crystallized the crisis when a British warship fired on an American frigate and forcibly removed sailors from its deck. Blood was spilled in plain sight. This was not a distant incident in foggy waters, but an open assault. The news raced through the country, igniting outrage that crossed party lines. Even those opposed to war felt the sting. If a national warship could be attacked so brazenly, what protection did any citizen truly have? Honor, once wounded, demands response. For many Americans, the question was no longer whether Britain's actions were unjust, but whether the United States would tolerate them. The language of independence was invoked again, echoing the revolutionary generation. Freedom, they argued, was not a condition granted by empires, but a status defended through resolve. To back down now would be to confess that the revolution had ended too soon, that the chains had merely been loosened, not broken. Impressment and Maritime control merged in the American imagination into a single narrative of disrespect. Britain did not see the United States as an equal nation, but as a former colony that had wandered too far from its place. Every seized sailor, every confiscated cargo reinforced that belief. War, then was framed not as ambition, but as necessity, a grim test of whether the Republic could enforce its own dignity. When Congress finally moved toward conflict, it did so under the weight of years of accumulated resentment. The declaration of war in 1812 was less a sudden decision than an admission that diplomacy had failed to protect honor. The United States stepped into war not because it was confident of victory, but because continued humiliation felt worse than the risks ahead, because allowing foreign powers to decide the fate of American citizens on the open sea meant accepting a future defined by submission, and once that line was crossed, the idea of sovereignty itself began to dissolve into something fragile and conditional, shaped not by law or principle, but by the reach of British guns and the silence of those who watch their sailors disappear over the horizon, knowing that every unanswered insult made the next one easier, more brutal, and more permanent. When war was declared in the summer of 18, confidence filled the halls of government, but it did not reach the ranks of the army. On paper, the United States believed itself capable of challenging the British Empire on land. In reality, it possessed a force that had not fought a major war in decades, led by officers whose experience belonged to another generation. The nation had won independence through revolution, but peace had hollowed out its readiness. Years of neglect, political distrust of standing armies, and reliance on militias left the country dangerously unprepared for the conflict it had chosen. The regular army was small, scattered across frontier posts, and poorly supplied. Weapons were outdated, uniforms mismatched, and training inconsistent. Many soldiers had never fired their muskets in combat. Militias, celebrated in American tradition as citizen defenders, proved unreliable once blood was spilled. They were brave in theory, but often unwilling to cross borders, abandon homes, or submit to discipline. Officers argued over authority. Governors resisted federal orders, and unity fractured before the first serious engagement had begun. Nowhere did this weakness show more clearly than in the invasion of Canada. American leaders believed that British control north of the border was shallow, that Canadian settlers would welcome liberation, that a swift strike would end the war early. This assumption was built on arrogance and ignorance. Canada was defended by British regulars, loyal militias, and Indigenous allies who understood the land far better than the invaders. The Americans crossed rivers expecting parades and found resistance instead. The campaign began with confusion. Orders were delayed or misunderstood. Commanders hesitated, fearing defeat more than disgrace. At Detroit, General William Hull embodied the crisis of leadership. Surrounded by British forces and native warriors, exaggerated in number by his own fear, Hull surrendered without a major battle. An entire American army laid down its arms. Soldiers wept, officers raged. The news shocked the nation. How could a republic that spoke so loudly of honor collapse so completely at the first test? The surrender at Detroit sent a message far beyond the battlefield. It told Britain that the United States was not yet a serious military power. It told native nations that American expansion could be resisted. It told Americans themselves that bravery alone was not enough. Panic spread along the frontier. Settlers fled. Rumors of massacres and invasions multiplied. Confidence, so abundant in Congress, evaporated among the people who now felt exposed and defenseless. Further attempts to push into Canada fared little better. At Queenston Heights, American troops crossed the Niagara River under fire. Some fought bravely, climbing steep slopes and holding ground against British regulars. But when reinforcements refused to cross the river, citing their militia obligations, those on the far shore were left isolated, surrounded, and outnumbered. They surrendered. Courage had been present, but coordination had not. The structure meant to support heroism failed it. These defeats were not the result of cowardice alone. Nay, they were the consequences of a nation divided in its approach to war. Many Americans opposed the conflict outright, New England merchants saw it as economic suicide. Federalists criticized the administration relentlessly, undermining morale and cooperation. Supplies were withheld. Loans were denied. Even as soldiers marched, political resistance at home weakened the war effort. The Army fought not only an external enemy, but internal skepticism that eroded its foundation. The officer corps reflected this division. Appointments were often political rather than merit-based. Age and reputation counted more than adaptability. Some generals were veterans of the Revolutionary War, men whose courage was unquestioned, but whose understanding of modern warfare had faded. They faced British officers trained in the unforgiving campaigns of Europe, men hardened by years of disciplined combat. The gap in experience was stark, and it showed in every mismanaged march and poorly planned assault. Logistics compounded the misery. Roads were primitive. Supply depots scarce. Soldiers went hungry. Boots wore out. Ammunition ran low. Disease spread through camps faster than orders. Desertion became common, not always from fear, but from exhaustion and neglect. The romantic image of war shattered under the weight of mud, hunger, and confusion. For many recruits, the reality of service bore no resemblance to the speeches that had sent them marching. British and Indigenous forces exploited this. Weaknesses skillfully. They struck quickly, withdrew into forests, and disrupted American advances. Native warriors fighting for their homelands used tactics unfamiliar to many American units. Fear magnified their effectiveness. Stories of attacks spread wildly, sometimes exaggerated, but always terrifying to troops unprepared for such warfare. The frontier became a place of constant tension, where every shadow suggested danger. Yet within these failures, lessons were being carved into experience. Officers began to understand the necessity of training, discipline, and unified command. The government slowly increased funding, expanded the Army, and sought competent leadership. These changes did not erase early disasters, but they planted the seeds of improvement. Painful defeats forced the nation to confront truths it had long avoided about the cost of independence and the price of maintaining it. The early campaigns revealed that freedom did not automatically create strength. It required institutions, preparation, and sacrifice sustained over time. The belief that citizen militias alone could defend a nation collided with reality. Courage needed structure to be effective. Patriotism needed planning. The war exposed the dangerous gap between American ideals and American readiness, a gap paid for by soldiers who marched north believing in quick victory and instead encountered confusion, surrender, and loss. And reports of failed invasions reached cities and towns. Public opinion shifted uneasily. Supporters of the war struggled to explain the setbacks. Opponents grew louder, pointing to each defeat as proof of folly. Families mourned sons lost not in heroic charges, but in chaotic retreats and unnecessary surrenders. The myth of easy conquest dissolved, replaced by the sobering realization that the British Empire was not a fading ghost of colonial memory, but a formidable, disciplined force, still capable of humiliation and destruction. The United States entered the War of 1812 with passion but without preparation, with ambition but without coordination. Its early military failures were not just tactical defeats, they were moral reckonings. They forced a young nation to confront the consequences of neglecting its defenses and underestimating its enemy. And in those cold camps and surrendered forts, the illusion of effortless independence was stripped away, leaving behind a harsher understanding of what it truly meant to stand as a sovereign nation in a world ruled by power and experience. While the land campaigns exposed weakness and confusion, the war at sea told a different story, one that surprised both enemies and Americans themselves. The United States Navy was small, almost insignificant when measured against the vast power of the Royal Navy, yet it carried something that numbers could not capture. Its crews were professional, its officers ambitious, and its ships built with care and purpose on the open ocean, far from the chaos of Pearl. Why coordinated armies and unreliable militias, American sailors found room to fight on their own terms. At the outbreak of war, Britain expected naval dominance to be automatic. The Royal Navy had hundreds of warships, crews hardened by years of constant combat against France, and a global network of bases. American vessels were few, and their destruction seemed inevitable. But what Britain underestimated was the quality of those ships and the resolve of the men who sailed them. American frigates were larger, more heavily armed and sturdily built. They were designed not to patrol an empire, but to fight when forced, and fight hard. When the first ship-to-ship victories came, they struck like thunder. The USS Constitution's defeat at HMS Guerriere shattered long-held assumptions. British sailors had believed their ships invincible, their naval tradition unquestionable. To see a British frigate beaten in open combat by an American vessel was more than a tactical loss. It was a psychological shock. Word spread quickly across the Atlantic. American ports erupted in celebration. Newspapers printed illustrations of shattered British masts and triumphant American decks. For a nation reeling from defeats on land, these victories felt like proof of worth. The sea battles were personal, brutal, and close. Cannon fire tore through hulls, splinters flew like knives. Decks ran slick with blood. Officers shouted orders through smoke and chaos. Sailors fought fires, reloaded guns, and ended to wounded comrades without pause. There was no room for hesitation. Victory depended on discipline and endurance, and American crews demonstrated both. Each successful engagement chipped away at British confidence and replaced American doubt with belief. Beyond the open ocean, the Great Lakes became critical arenas. Control of these waters meant control of supply lines, troop movement, and entire regions. Here, the war took on a raw, improvised character. Ships were built from scratch in wilderness shipyards, timber cut from nearby forests, cannons dragged across mud and snow. Men who had never seen a naval battle found themselves aboard vessels that would decide the fate of frontiers. On Lake Erie, the stakes were enormous. British control threatened American positions in the Northwest and emboldened Indigenous resistance. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry understood that defeat would mean disaster. His fleet was hastily assembled, its crews inexperienced, yet the urgency of the moment forged them into something more than the sum of their parts. When battle came, it was relentless. Perry's flagship was hammered into ruin, guns silenced, casualties mounting. Many commanders would have surrendered. Perry did not. In a moment that bordered on madness, he left his shattered ship, climbed into a small boat, and crossed under enemy fire to another vessel. The image of that crossing captured the spirit of the naval war. Risk embraced, fear set aside, determination carried forward, art by sheer will. When the British fleet finally struck its colors, the victory transformed the strategic situation. American forces regained the Northwest. British plans collapsed. The message Perry sent afterward was simple, almost understated, yet it carried the weight of everything the nation needed to hear. These victories did more than shift control of water. They reshaped the emotional landscape of the war. After months of embarrassment and loss, Americans saw proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with Britain and win. Sailors returned to port as heroes. Children learned their names, songs were written, stories told, and pride rekindled. The Navy became a symbol of competence in a war marked by failure elsewhere, even when British blockades tightened. Choking American trade and patrolling the coastline, the psychological damage had already been done. Britain could restrict movement, but it could not erase the fact that its ships had been beaten. The aura of invincibility was gone. Every British captain now approached an American sail with caution rather than certainty. That shift, subtle yet profound, altered the balance of respect between empire and republic. Naval success also strengthened American diplomacy. Negotiators abroad could point to victories at sea as evidence that the United States was not merely enduring the war, but shaping it. This mattered deeply in a conflict where perception often mattered as much as territory. A nation that could defend its P.S. could defend its interests. Maritime success reinforced the very sovereignty that impressment and blockade had threatened to erase. The Great Lakes victories echoed far inland. They stabilized frontiers, reassured settlers, and weakened alliances that had depended on British strength. Native nations, watching the tide turn on the water, faced shifting realities. Supplies dwindled. Confidence wavered. The war remained tragic and destructive, but naval control narrowed the scope of disaster and prevent total collapse in key regions. For the sailors themselves, the war forged a lasting identity. They were no longer colonial seamen or experimental officers. They were professionals of a national navy that had proven itself under fire. Their experience would shape future generations, influence ship design, training, and doctrine. The lessons learned amid smoke and splintered wood would echo long after the cannons fell silent. In contrast to the confusion on land, the Navy demonstrated what preparation, leadership, and discipline could achieve even against overwhelming odds. It showed that the United States did not lack courage or capability, only focus and investment. The sea became the arena where the Republic found its footing, where humiliation was answered with resolve rather than retreat. Each naval victory carried emotional weight beyond its immediate effect. It told families who had lost sons to impressment that Americans could strike back. It told soldiers struggling on muddy roads that the nation was not failing everywhere. It told Britain that the war would not be easy, that this former colony would not simply fold under pressure. As the conflict dragged on, naval engagements continued to punctuate the war with moments of clarity and pride. They did not end the suffering, nor did they guarantee victory, but they sustained morale when morale mattered most. In the rolling decks and booming guns of American ships, the young nation glimpsed what it could become when unity replaced division and preparation matched principle. And in that hard-earned confidence, the war at sea stood as a counterbalance to despair, a reminder that even in a flawed and faltering campaign, courage and competence could still rise to the surface and hold fast against the tide. By 1814, the war had entered a darker phase, one shaped not by ambition, but by exhaustion and retaliation. Britain, no longer consumed by Napoleon's armies in Europe, could finally turn its full attention toward the United States. Veteran troops crossed the Atlantic, disciplined and confident, carrying with them the weight of an empire that had survived decades of war. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a symbolic assault on the heart of the young republic. The Chesapeake Bay became the gateway. British ships moved inland with ease, their presence a reminder of naval dominance despite earlier American victories. Coastal towns felt exposed, undefended, and vulnerable. Militia units scattered. Civilians fled inland with whatever they could carry. The sense of security Americans had once believed their capital possessed dissolved rapidly. As British columns marched toward Washington, Washington was not yet a grand city. It was a work in progress, more promise than power. Its buildings stood widely spaced, its defenses minimal, its leadership uncertain. When British forces approached, confusion reigned, orders conflicted. Militia units assembled and dissolved with equal speed. At Bladensburg, the American defense collapsed almost immediately. Poor coordination, panic, and inexperience turned the engagement into a rout. Soldiers fled, government officials fled, and the road to the capital lay open. As British troops entered Washington, they found a city abandoned by its leaders. The symbols of American governance stood empty, silent. Then the fires began. The Capitol was set ablaze, its unfinished dome silhouetted against the night sky. The president's house followed, flames devouring the interior. Public buildings burned one after another, the glow visible for miles. It was a deliberate act meant to punish and humiliate, to demonstrate the consequences of defiance against imperial power, For Americans, the burning of Washington cut deeply. This was not just a military loss, it was an attack on national dignity. Newspapers struggled to describe the shock. Citizens grappled with disbelief. The capital of the United States torched by a four-egg. An army felt like a reversal of history itself. Critics of the war seized on the moment as proof of incompetence. Supporters were forced into silence, mourning not only destruction but shame. Yet even in this humiliation, the British advance revealed its limits. After burning the capital, British forces withdrew, having achieved spectacle but not submission. The Republic still stood. The government returned. Reconstruction began almost immediately. The ruins became reminders not of defeat alone, but of survival. The shock of the flames hardened resolve rather than extinguishing it. That resolve would be tested almost immediately at Baltimore. The city was a vital port and a symbol of American resistance. British commanders expected another swift victory. Instead, they encountered preparation and defiance. Baltimore's defenses were strengthened, its militia organized, its citizens determined. At the center of this defense stood Fort McHenry, guarding the harbor like a final lock against invasion. And the British fleet began its bombardment. The night erupted into chaos. Shells arced through the sky, bursting above the fort. Rockets screamed, leaving trails of fire. The ground shook with each explosion. Inside the fort, defenders waited, enduring hours of relentless attack. They could not respond effectively to the distant ships. All they could do was hold. The bombardment lasted through the night, an unbroken storm of noise and fear from the water, from nearby shores. Servers watched, unsure whether the fort still stood. Smoke obscured everything. Darkness hid the outcome. For the defenders, time stretched painfully. Each explosion threatened to tear apart the walls, to end the stand that now carried the weight of national pride. As dawn approached, the guns fell silent. Slowly, the smoke cleared. Then it appeared, the American flag still flying above the fort, tattered, massive, unmistakable. It had endured the night. It had not fallen. In that moment, the meaning of resistance crystallized. The fort had not been taken. Baltimore had not fallen. The humiliation of Washington was answered with defiance. The defense of Fort McHenry resonated far beyond the battlefield. It transformed despair into determination. A nation that had watched its capital burn now saw proof that it could still hold the line. The flag became more than fabric. It became a witness to endurance, a signal that the Republic was battered but unbroken. The British assault on Baltimore failed, losses mounted, morale wavered. What had seemed an unstoppable campaign lost momentum. The empire could burn cities, but it could not extinguish resolve. The psychological tide began to shift. Americans no longer saw themselves solely as victims of a superior force. They had resisted, and resistance mattered. And the aftermath, the contrast between Washington and Baltimore, defined the war's emotional center. One represented vulnerability and humiliation. The other represented unity. Thank you and perseverance. Together, they revealed the stakes of the conflict. This was not merely a struggle over trade or territory, but over symbols, legitimacy, and belief in the future. The burning of the capital exposed the cost of unpreparedness and division. The defense of Fort McHenry demonstrated what organization and shared purpose could achieve. These moments became lessons written in fire and smoke. They reshaped public memory, turning catastrophe into resolve and despair into identity. As rebuilding began in Washington, stone replaced ash and determination replaced doubt. The scars remained visible, but they served as reminders rather than warnings. The war had reached into the nation's core and tested it brutally. What emerged was not confidence born of easy victory, but resilience forged under pressure. A recognition that survival itself could be an act of defiance, and that even when the heart of the nation burned, its spirit could still rise through smoke and darkness carried forth by those who refused to let the symbols of their experiment in self-rule be reduced to nothing more than embers scattered by an empire unwilling to accept that its former colony had chosen a different destiny. As the War of 1812 drew toward its conclusion, one engagement would capture the imagination of the young republic and define its memory of the conflict in ways that mattered more than treaties or territorial gains. That engagement was the Battle of New Orleans, fought in January. Erie 1815, months after peace had technically been declared in Europe. It was not the largest battle nor the most strategically decisive in the global sense, but it became the defining moment of the war because it symbolized a transformation in American identity, confidence, and pride. Andrew Jackson, the man who commanded American forces at New Orleans, was a figure born of frontier life. He had fought in previous conflicts, served as a lawyer, and built a reputation as a stern, sometimes ruthless leader. By 1815, he was no stranger to controversy or hardship. Yet in the swamps, levees, and waterways around New Orleans, he found the opportunity to mold a disparate group of soldiers into a unified force capable of facing the world's most experienced army. The composition of his command reflected the complexity of the young nation: regular army troops, state militias, free men of color, native allies, and even pirates from the surrounding waters. It was a coalition held together not by tradition or hierarchy, but by shared purpose and the urgency of survival. The British, in contrast, approached New Orleans with confidence born of experience. Their officers were disciplined, their troops seasoned, and their strategies honed in the fires of European warfare. They expected to overwhelm a city they presumed poorly defended, underestimated. Both the terrain and the determination of those who defended it. The Americans, hidden behind hastily constructed earthworks, waited. The Mississippi River swamps and marshes became natural fortifications, amplifying the effectiveness of even small numbers of defenders. When the attack began, it was a brutal, calculated assault. British soldiers advanced in traditional formations across open ground, expecting to apply the methods that had succeeded countless times in Europe. But the Americans were prepared. Rifles and artillery cut through the ranks. Earthworks absorbed the momentum of the charge, while disciplined volleys shattered cohesion. The swampy ground slowed the attackers, breaking the rhythm of their advance. Each wave was met with fierce resistance, and each failed attempt cost heavily in blood and morale. Casualties mounted. The British assault was relentless, yet the Americans held. The defenders knew the terrain intimately, used it strategically, and maintained discipline under fire. Jackson's leadership was both strict and inspiring. He moved among the troops, issued orders decisively, and refused to allow panic or retreat. Men of different backgrounds, some previously mistrustful of each other, fought side by side. In those hours, the concept of American became tangible, forged in smoke, mud, and shared danger. The psychological impact of the battle was profound. For the American soldiers, many of whom had seen previous campaigns end in confusion or retreat, this was a vindication of effort, training, and courage. For the British, it was a shock. Their experience and discipline had carried them through countless victories in Europe, yet here, in unfamiliar territory, they faced a defense that matched their resolve and outmaneuvered their tactics. The defeat, stark and humiliating, forced a reconsideration of both strategy and assumptions about the capabilities of this former colony. New Orleans also had an effect far beyond the battlefield. News of the victory traveled quickly through American towns and cities. Newspapers lauded the bravery of the troops and the genius of Jackson's leadership. Stories emphasized the diverse composition of the forces, highlighting that citizens from all walks of life had contributed to the defense of the nation. Patriots found in the battle a unifying narrative, one that transcended regional dispute, partisan debates, and prior embarrassment from earlier failures in the war. It was a moment of collective pride, a tangible proof that the Republic could withstand and repel one of the greatest military powers of the age. Politically, the victory provided momentum for Jackson and for a nation that had struggled to assert itself. It offered a sense of closure that the formal treaty, which had already been signed but not yet ratified, could not provide. In the public imagination, even as diplomats negotiated in Ghent, thousands of miles away, the guns of New Orleans wrote a story of American resilience and effectiveness. Leaders and citizens alike could claim not just survival but triumph. The battle became emblematic of a nation learning to assert itself with confidence, courage, and ingenuity. The human dimension of the Battle of New Orleans is often overshadowed by the dramatic imagery of muskets, cannons, and earthworks, yet it was in the faces of individual soldiers, in the exhaustion of men who had marched, dug, and fought through swamps and fever that the war's deeper meaning emerged. Ordinary people performed extraordinary acts under fire. Free men of color defended positions alongside white militias. Indigenous allies contributed crucial knowledge of the terrain. Even local volunteers, some with little formal training, held their ground against disciplined British columns. In that diverse defense, the essence of the American experiment, unity amid difference, was made manifest on the battlefield. The aftermath of the battle reinforced these lessons. While the broader war concluded with few territorial changes and unresolved issues, New Orleans became a source of enduring confidence. It demonstrated that tactical skill, determination, and leadership could overcome disparity in numbers and resources. It showed that the United States, though young and imperfect, had the capacity to defend itself decisively. The narrative of national strength shifted, offering an identity rooted not only in independence but in proven resilience. For Andrew Jackson personally, New Orleans marked the beginning of his rise to national prominence. He became a symbol of leadership forged in adversity, of a frontier toughness applied to national defense. His persona as a decisive, unyielding commander resonated with Americans who saw heroes after years of frustration and humiliation elsewhere in the war. Jackson embodied the spirit of a nation that could survive humiliation, organize effectively under pressure, and achieve remarkable feats against the odds. Beyond politics and personal fame, the Battle of New Orleans contributed to the shaping of American culture and memory. Songs, poems, and accounts spread the story widely, emphasizing not only the tactics but the courage, unity, and determination displayed by the defenders. Generations would look back on the battle as a moment when the United States had proven itself against formidable odds, a touchstone for national pride, and an example of what the fledgling republic could achieve when necessity and resolve converged. The victory also highlighted the interconnectedness of the war's multiple theaters. While early failures in Canada and on the Chesapeake had exposed weaknesses, New Orleans demonstrated the capacity to learn, adapt, and apply knowledge strategically. It showed that resilience could coexist with ingenuity and that leadership and preparation could turn potential catastrophe into defining triumph. In the minds of Americans, this battle transcended the war's otherwise inconclusive outcomes, becoming a symbol of identity, endurance, and the assertion of national strength on the global stage. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.